Welcome back to our final week of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Wilmington on my Girls Rock Productions channel. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more content. This month we have visited some of the most haunted buildings in the port city, from pubs to theaters, and in this final week we will be visiting some of the more haunted landmarks. The Riverwalk has been one of Wilmington's most awe-inspiring features for just under 40 years. It stretches about 2 miles along the Cape Fear River and weaves through shops, restaurants, and other riverside attractions that have been bringing in tourists from all over the country. You can actually grab a cone at Kilwin's, which is an ice cream shop, and stroll along the river at sunset when the sky behind the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge is pink and orange. It's all very romantic, but there is a dark side to the Riverwalk and its deceiving views. Since 1980, the city of Wilmington has put over $33 million into building, expanding, and repairing the Riverwalk that's a constant threat from hurricanes and strong currents. The currents pushing in from the Atlantic Ocean make the Cape Fear one of the deadliest rivers in all of North Carolina. And aside from those currents, there are steep drop-offs, pits, gators, sharks, and undergrowth, which cause people to actually have to be rescued from the Cape Fear each year. But not all of these will survive long enough to be rescued. In fact, at least a dozen people have drowned in the river in the last decade alone. The 19th century would bring about steamboat travel, which would be fast, cheap, and disaster-prone. In 1857, the boiler on the steamboat Magnolia exploded, killing right in the middle of the Cape Fear, killing at least a dozen people on board. Then, just 3 years later, the boiler on the steamboat Cape McLaurin would also explode, this time killing 3 of her crew members, but luckily there were no passengers on board. In this video, I will be talking about multiple haunted places along the Cape Fear area, from the river that has been surrounded by death for centuries, to a road where many slaves were forced to march along, from an alleyway with a phantom horseman to Wilmington's old graveyards. And we will end with the battleship turned memorial, the Cape Fear River, Mount Misery Road, St. Thomas Preservation Hall alleyway, St. James Graveyard, Oakdale Cemetery, Bellevue Cemetery, and the Battleship, North Carolina. I will start with one of the most bone-chilling stories to come out of the area on the Cape Fear River. With all the deaths surrounding the Cape Fear River over the centuries, you'd think there'd be hundreds of ghost stories about phantom noises and apparitions. But there's not. There's only one story. In April of 1891, a beautiful steamboat by the name of the Wilmington was brought into town. She was purchased by Captain John W. Harper with the purpose of ferrying passengers and mail from Wilmington to Southport. The steamboat quickly became a beloved fixture of Wilmington, and she could hold 500 people at full capacity. And due to the speed, affordability, and romanticism of steamboat travel, the Wilmington and Harper became almost as popular as the railroad. With an experienced captain at the helm, they also didn't have to worry about explosions or other mishaps. That is, until one frigid Christmas Eve. A violent winter storm had been pounding Wilmington for 3 days with freezing rain and wind, but it looked like it was about to clear up, so Harper decided to prepare the Wilmington to ferry a group of passengers down to Southport. The people boarded the boat, bundled up and with their neatly wrapped Christmas presents, but one of the engines malfunctioned just as they were about to take off, leaving them stranded at the docks. Harper desperately tried to convince the passengers that they would be getting going as soon as possible, but they reacted the way most travelers do today. They stormed off. The only passenger remaining on board was a man named McMillan. Harper sat chatting and smoking with the man as they waited for the news. Macmillan began to tell Harper a story about 3 Highlanders who were said to be executed in Brunswick Town, which is roughly 15 miles south of Wilmington, and this was during the Revolutionary War. They were gathered up by a British colonel and sentenced to death for supporting the Patriot cause. On the day of the execution, 2 of the men were tied to a tree and shot, but the third was able to overpower the guards and escaped into the woods. He ran for hours until he ended up in Robeson County, which is where he started a family and would live out a full life. Harper asked Macmillan how he knew of these things, and he simply responded that he was the great-grandson of the 3rd Highlander. But his story wouldn't end there. In the years following the war, the people of Brunswick Town would see 2 men clinging to a rowing barge in the middle of the river. The men would be haggard and wearing tattered Highlander dress. As soon as anyone would try to help these men, they and the boat would disappear. Did the Highlanders haunt the site of their death, or was it all just a myth? Harper knew it was common for people to tell ghost stories around the fire to get through a harsh winter. He figured that Macmillan's family probably told him this story years ago to get through a cold winter's night, and now Macmillan was just doing the same for him. When the passenger finished telling his tale, Harper got word that the engine was repaired. He thanked Macmillan for his company and started the trek down to Southport. The storm, however, would still rage on, so there was a sheet of snow making it almost impossible to see. The Wilmington's voyage down to Southport was anything but smooth. Harper suddenly felt a violent jolt. The steamboat was now stuck on a jetty, and the crew was stranded again. They could only wait for the tide to rise and lift the boat, so they gathered around the fire. It was then that Harper realized that they were actually near the site of Macmillan's ghost story. They actually would pass it every day on their journey south. While they were waiting, the first mate, Peter Jurgensen, he was pacing around on the upper deck. He was thinking of warm fires, Christmas presents, and delicious food, anything to keep his mind off of the storm. Suddenly, a man appeared right in front of him. The man was dripping and his beard was caked in ice. His eyes were wild, like he was about to attack Jorgensen. Then, the startled first mate tried to question him, but to no avail. The man just stared silently. When Jorgensen tried to walk towards the man, he disappeared. Now, Jurgensen quickly ran down the stairs to the captain and the rest of the crew, and he was visibly shaken when he relayed the story, but they told him that he was just extremely drunk. Harper did agree to search the boat, but he jokingly warned the crew to be on the lookout for more ghosts. When the search ended, the tide and the storm had lifted, and they couldn't find the man, so they would just continue down now that they could finally see the dark waters of the Cape Fear stretched out in front of them. The Wilmington raced off of the jetty and they continued down to Southport. When they were passing modern-day Carolina Beach, they actually would hear the cries of help. These cries were coming from 2 men clinging to an old seaweed-covered rowing barge. The men looked haggard and were wearing traditional Highlander dress. When Harper told his crew to throw them a line, the men disappeared. Seconds later, the massive boat would about run over a capsized vessel that floated in front of it. There were 2 men on board, so the crew helped them up on deck. Now, these were not the Highlanders they had just seen. In fact, they looked nothing like them, aside from being wet and frozen. However, one of the men did look exactly like the man Jurgensen saw when they were stranded on the jetty. The crew questioned the man and found out that they had boarded a ship headed to Nassau when they were overtaken by the storm. They then clung to the lifeboat and waited to be rescued. The man did admit that he was going in and out of consciousness in the freezing water, but he didn't recognize the steamboat or Jorgensen. At this point, the captain and crew, well, they were exhausted, so they just handed the men some warm blankets and dismissed the whole ordeal. The Wilmington arrived at its destination as the sun began to rise over the snow-covered banks of Southport. As Harper paused to take in the rare sight of a white Christmas in North Carolina, he began to think about the encounter he had the night before. Had he really rescued 2 shipwreck victims from the river? Or was McMillan's ghost story true? Harper knew that the Cape Fear was dangerous even on calm, sunny days. So how did these men survive the storm, the freezing water, and the currents for so long? Now, Harper was never able to solve this mystery, but he did recount the story to a good friend and local historian, James Sprits, who would write down a colonial apparition, forever cementing it in Wilmington lore. Captain Harper died in 1917 and the Wilmington was sold in the 1930s. As for McMillan, there is actually no record of him after that night. So, my friends, was he really the great-grandson of an escaped prisoner? Or was he the ghost of an escaped prisoner cursed to tell the tale to anyone who would listen? So let's leave the river that is haunted by Highlanders and head over to a road with a history as dark as its name would suggest, Mount Misery Road. Located just across the Cape Fear River in one of the fastest growing towns in the U.S., Leland, North Carolina, is Mount Misery Road. It is a long and winding road that starts off on US 74 and 76 near Leland and weaves through Navassa and rural Brunswick County before ending up at the town of Northwest. According to local legend, Mount Misery was a sandhill that stood 25 feet high. It was located north of Eagles Island and about 7 miles from Wilmington in what is now Navassa, near Sutton Plant. The name Mount Misery first appears on a map by the cartographer John Collet in 1770 and can be found on maps through the early 1800s. There was even a ferry across the Cape Fear River that would operate there in the 1700s. But at some point, this sandhill would cease to exist. No one really knows exactly why. There are a couple theories as to why the area got this name. The historian Claude V. Jackson III has written that the area near Mount Misery was difficult land to work, giving it its name. This is the more positive reason for the name. The second reason is much more dark. This one involves enslaved Africans being taken off boats near Mount Misery and being forced to walk the 90 miles to Fayetteville. This was a miserable trek, and it is likely that many died on this forced march. The road does lead in the direction of Fayetteville, so this story does track. With a name like Mount Misery, it's not surprising that the road is said to have quite a few ghost stories. People on the road will hear the eerie late-night sounds of moaning and clanking chains. People have also stated that they experience unexplainable bouts of fear while driving down Mount Misery Road. But there is a strange twist to this whole story. It appears that Mount Misery Road used to be in a completely different location. George Beatty Jr. of Leland said he was doing some research on property in Brunswick County purchased by his father in the 1930s from the Reeves family, which is how Reeves Chapel on Cedar Hill Road got its name. While digging through those property records, he found a deed from 1907 listing Reeves Chapel, which dates all the way back to the 1860s, as being on Mount Misery Road. One local theory for this is that in the 1970s, when many of the rural roads in Brunswick County didn't even have names, they would actually finally give these roads names or rename them to make things easier for postal and emergency workers to navigate. So now let's leave this road where people hear the clanking of chains and move over to an alleyway where people spot a strange man searching in the road. St. Thomas Preservation Hall alleyway. On the corner of 3rd and Dock Streets, you'll find the St. Thomas Preservation Hall. And there's a small alleyway just behind the building, and it is in the area of that alleyway where an English gentleman would go missing one dark night in the 1760s. The story begins in 1760 when a young man by the name of Llewellyn Markwick would arrive from England, bearing letters of introduction from prominent Londoners. On one hand, he wore a ring that was very close to his heart. It was a large ring depicting two intertwining snakes with their heads upright. Clasped in their jaws was a giant diamond. This ring was special because it was one of a kind and a replica of his family crest. Markwick was known to be an avid rider, and he had a very well-trained horse. It is said that he could dismount the animal, point in the direction of the stable, and slap it twice on the neck, and the horse would just trot off to its stall. One night, Markwick told the stableman that he was going on a ride and would return later that evening. Sure enough, the horse was found back in his stall the next morning, but Markwick was nowhere to be seen. Despite an extensive search, Llewellyn was never heard from alive again. A few years later, in 1768, a terrible storm would hit Wilmington. The morning after it passed, a man was walking along a sandy road near present-day 3rd and Dock Streets when he noticed a large portion of the road had been washed away. As he was walking around the large eroded area, he noticed something shiny protruding from the muck. He would then climb down into the hole and try to lift the object, but it was affixed to the ground. Just as he would begin to try to dig it out, another passerby would jump into the hole to lend a hand. Suddenly, they found out what this shiny object was. It was a bony hand with a ring attached to one of the fingers. As they finished uncovering the body, the riding clothes confirmed it. This was Llewellyn Markwick. It was quickly discovered that he was shot in the back, but robbery was immediately ruled out since his ring and purse were still found on his body. It was decided then that this was probably a case of mistaken identity. From all appearances, he was shot while riding along the old Brunswick Ferry Road heading into town. When his horse immediately started trotting off to its stall, the assailants realized their mistake. As the horse was trotting off to his stall, Markwick's body was dragged to a wooded area, believed to be next to where the present-day St. Thomas Preservation Hall stands. Root mass in the area would have prevented creating a hastily hand-dug grave, so an area was prepared in the soft sand of the roadway. The storm-eroded roadway was repaired, but for decades, a portion of the road remained susceptible to collapse. Some would argue that the soil simply wasn't compacted enough, but it wasn't the entire large area that had been washed away during the storm. It was only the small portion of the area that had contained Markwick's grave. When they eventually covered the roads with asphalt, that issue went away. But a new problem would start up along this road. So, It was around this time that locals would report seeing a strangely dressed man stumbling about 3rd and Dock Streets, desperately looking for help. When any good Samaritans stop to try to help him, the man simply vanishes right before their eyes. Even law enforcement officers have witnessed this man. Others have also reported seeing Llewellyn still astride his faithful steed. One evening, a family was walking up Dock Street when they noticed a man on a horse outside the alleyway of St. Thomas Preservation Hall. The children begged to pet the animal, but unsure who this strangely dressed man was, the father decided to approach first. Before he could even ask a question, the massive horse would rear up with legs flailing, then crashed back down to the ground and charged down the alleyway before disappearing. Family quickly raced back home, scared to death. Many locals don't believe that this is his well-trained horse that he's seen riding. That's what he is looking for so desperately. Legend has it that if he finally finds his horse, he can finally make the long journey back home, setting his spirit free forever. Let's move on from this alleyway haunted by a missing gentleman and head over to a cemetery that has brought about a couple of famous phrases. The St. James Graveyard. St. James Graveyard is the oldest maintained graveyard in all of Wilmington. It opened its gates back in 1757 and was adjacent to the St. James Church. For a while, this was the only official graveyard in Wilmington, and it spanned much further than it does today. But in the 1800s, when they expanded the St. James Parish Episcopal Church, they would then eventually move a good bit of the graves and bodies over to the Oakdale Cemetery to help with overcrowding. However, unmarked graves have been found all over the historic downtown, with the most recent being uncovered back in 2014. Some of the more notable figures buried in the St. James Graveyard are veterans from both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, poet and writer Thomas Godfrey, and the most famous ghost in all of Wilmington, Samuel Jocelyn. Now, Jocelyn's story begins one dark, cold night in March of 1809. He and his young bride, Marianne Sampson, would get into a heated discussion. This would cause Samuel to get so flustered that he would rush out of the house, mount his horse, and ride off into the cold winter's night. As he was riding along a frozen creek, Jocelyn's horse got spooked by something in the distance, causing him to be bucked from its back into the frigid, shallow water, where his body would lie for the next 3 days. When they would finally find Samuel's body, his skin was cold to the touch and there was no pulse, so they pronounced him dead due to reasons of exposure and buried him in the St. James Graveyard. Samuel was loved and mourned by many, including his wife and also his best friend, Alexander Hostler. Samuel and Alexander were schoolmates, and they had a pact from when they were back in their college days. Whichever of the two were to die first, they would come back and visit from beyond the grave to prove that there was life after death. And that night after his funeral, Samuel would make good on that promise. That night, Alexander would awaken to find Samuel Jocelyn standing at the foot of his bed. As he was sitting up to wipe away the sleep from his eyes, he heard Jocelyn ask him, How? How could you bury me when I'm still alive?" He would disappear by the time Alexander was fully awake. Figuring that this was just a dream and not wanting to seem crazy, he didn't say anything the next day. Again that evening, Hostler would awaken to find Samuel Jocelyn at the foot of his bed, this time pleading with him, How? How could you bury me when I'm still alive?" Hostler again writes it off. His best friend just died, and he was in mourning. maybe he had had a little too much to drink. Either way, he didn't want to seem crazy, so again, he wouldn't say anything. But for the third straight night, Hostler would awaken to find Samuel Jocelyn again at the foot of his bed, this time desperately begging him, How could you bury me when I'm still alive? Now at this point, Alexander had it. He grabbed another of their good friends, and both of them would grab their shovels and torches and would head down to the St. James graveyard in the middle of the night, where they would begin to dig up Samuel Jocelyn's grave. When they finally got the coffin lid open, to Alexander's horror, Samuel was no longer lying in the position he was buried in. His face was now frozen in fear, and his fingers were now ground down to the bone and bloodied from where he had been trying to dig his way out of the coffin he had been buried alive in. Now, what led to him being buried alive was this. He was actually suffering from hypothermia, which causes the skin to be cold to the touch and the pulse to slow to pretty much nothing. And since we didn't have the tools we have today to detect life, Samuel would have survived those 3 days in that frigid water, only to die the more horrific and gruesome death of being buried alive. This incident would actually scar Hostler so much that he would go on to invent what is known as the dead ringer. They would tie a string to the wrist or ankle of the recently deceased, with the other of the end of the string being tied to a bell above the grave. If that person were to wake up because they were actually still alive, the bell would ring, causing the person to be rescued. This would also bring about what is known as the graveyard shift. Someone would have to stay in the graveyards from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. to listen for the bells. And also, there is a local legend that does to this day talk about how sometimes you can see a shadow standing next to a grave under an oak tree in the cemetery. Is this Samuel Jocelyn still trying desperately to be saved? Or is it the ghost of his friend who arrived too late to save him? Now let's head out of the oldest cemetery in Wilmington and check out two more historic cemeteries, Oakdale and Bellevue. But we'll start with the one for the haves, Oakdale. So by the mid-19th century, the St. James graveyard and town burial grounds were becoming overcrowded. This would lead to concern over the health of the community of Wilmington. A group of citizens would form the proprietors of the Wilmington cemeteries, and they would buy a 65-acre tract on the east side of the Burnt Mill Creek, just east of the town's limits. The property became known as Oakdale, and it was the first rural cemetery in the state. Oakdale was designed in the picturesque Victorian mode associated with the rural cemeteries. The designer was the surveyor Lewis C. Turner, and it was planned as a maze of curvilinear avenues winding through the hilly terrain. The drives are depressed and the plots raised behind masonry walls. The site also has the appearance of a formal garden and garden furniture and iron fences to enhance the whole park aesthetic. The first burial in the cemetery was on February 5th, 1855. It was for 6-year-old Annie de Rosset, and it would soon become the cemetery for the elite of Wilmington. Many wealthy families would have their family members move to Oakdale, mostly in the first couple of years of the cemeteries being open from 1855 to 1859, but even all the way up to the 1920s. This is actually why some of the death dates on the graves are from long before the cemetery was ever established. The residents would use these mid-19th century cemeteries as parks, places to stroll, and enjoy nature and the company of friends. Oakdale does have legends that surround 3 of its permanent residents: a sea captain, an entertainer, and a teacher. Our first spirit is Captain Josephus Franklin Bustles. One night while Bustles was out at sea, he came across a boat stranded in the water. He approached the vessel and then towed it close. He checked inside and said, "Come on board." At that moment he asked the man inside, "What is your profession?" To which the man replied, "I am the President of the United States." It turns out this was Grover Cleveland, the 22nd President of the United States. Bustles would pass away in 1919 and was buried in the Oakdale Cemetery. Next we have Don Hartman, whose grave marker says, "Died pleasing the public." Hartman was orphaned at a young age and would become an aerialist and trapeze artist for the Four Aces Flying Troupe. He would plummet 25 feet to his death in Legion Stadium when the wind would shake the platform he was standing on. The fall would break his neck, arm, foot, and all of his ribs. Hartman would be buried in Oakdale in 1937. Our final spirit in the Oakdale Cemetery is that of Lizzie B. Turlington. Lizzie's tale is a tragic one. She was a deaf and mute teacher back in the 1880s, and she was dating Walter Bingham at the time of her death, and he was also deaf and mute. After contracting a disease that would leave him disfigured, Mr. Bingham would be constantly bullied. His friends would even taunt him, stating that Lizzie would leave him and that she was already having an affair with another teacher. This, of course, was a lie. Unfortunately for Lizzie, Walter would begin to believe it. He would pick her up from school one day, slit her throat, shot her in the head, and then dumped her body in the woods near Raleigh. And he would then hop a train and disappear into history. She would be buried in Oakdale Cemetery in 1886. Now let's leave the Victorian-era cemetery for the elites and head over to the cemetery where the have-nots were buried during that time. Bellevue Cemetery. Even though it is located just across the narrow Burnt Mill Creek, the two cemeteries couldn't be more different. With its iron fences and beautiful gardens, Oakdale Cemetery looks more like a park than an actual cemetery. But Bellevue is only surrounded by a chain link fence that many a drunken driver has driven through, destroying stones over the years. Oakdale has groundskeepers paid to keep up the cemetery's polished look, whereas Bellevue has become overgrown with vines since it's only maintained by people sentenced to community service. This look did make it perfect for filming due to its spooky vibes for Sleepy Hollow when they were filming in Wilmington back in the early 2000s. In 1855, when overcrowding became a problem in the St. James Parish graveyard, it became clear to the city that they needed a new place to bury their loved ones. The Oakdale Cemetery was created, and it quickly became the cemetery for the elites. But many of the blue-collared people who would become lost to history also needed a place to be laid to rest, and they could never afford the plots in the Oakdale Cemetery. This is why the Bellevue Cemetery was started up in 1876 by John D. Bellevue Jr. and John S. McCutcheon. Just because these people were forgotten by history doesn't mean their lives weren't important. One sad story is that of Michael Thomas Davis. Michael Davis would have fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and he would lose his arm to the lost cause. Still, he would return home and start a new life with his wife and stepdaughter. After the war, he would get a job as a night watchman for the Naval Store Yard. One evening, his wife and stepdaughter came to town on the train. They'd been visiting friends in Chadbourn, about 55 miles out of Wilmington, and they decided to stop by the yard on their way home. When they arrived on the opposite side of the Cape Fear River, Davis would paddle over to pick them up in his skiff. He helped his wife into the boat and was guiding his daughter over the side when the boat tipped, tossing all three of them into the river. Davis was able to hold to the side of the skiff, but could not hang on to both women. It was all he could do to save his own life, being as he only had one arm. He would yell out for 10 minutes straight, when finally two sailors from a Norwegian bark had swam over to his rescue. It was too late for Davis's family, though. Sadly, he watched helplessly as they drowned. Davis would go on to live to the age of 96, and when he passed, the Daughters of the Confederacy would pay for his gravestone and plot in Bellevue. Bellevue is also where a father and son share a grave. These men were both executed by the electric chair in 1925. Charles and William Elmer Stewart were convicted of killing two police officers who discovered their illegal still during Prohibition. Now let's leave the cemetery of the forgotten and head to our final stop in Wilmington, a World War II battleship that is now a museum, the battleship North Carolina. The battleship North Carolina is permanently docked on the Cape Fear River, just across the way from the Riverwalk. She is a highly decorated World War II battleship that stands an astounding 15 stories tall and weighs 35,000 tons. She has been fully restored with authentic 1940s antiques and is now a museum and memorial to the 10,000 North Carolinians who would have died during the war. During the years of its commission from 1942 to 1947, the North Carolina did see its fair share of death, tragedy, and heartbreak. On August 24, 1942, a sailor was shot and killed in the back by a low-flying Japanese plane in the ship's first official battle, but he was only the second man to die on board the ship. The first was Thurman Thompson. Thompson was heading up a ladder to get breakfast one morning when he was struck in the back of the head by a heavy piece of machinery, causing him to fall to his death right in front of another sailor. Thompson wasn't newlywed, so the U.S. Navy did have to inform his young bride that he did die in a freak accident before ever facing the Japanese. The ship's deadliest attack would occur in September of 1942. A Japanese torpedo would ram into the ship's port side, knocking her and her crew sideways. As the ship began to quake and take on water, the crew would rush to their battle stations, where they began to strategically flood compartments on the opposite side of the ship to keep it from sinking, while they braced themselves for more blows, which, luckily for them, would never come. 3 of the torpedoes would strike an American aircraft carrier, causing it to sink, and another would badly damage a destroyer. Of the 3 ships, the North Carolina came out relatively unscathed. Even so, 5 men did die in the initial blast, and another 23 were wounded. The ship would fight back with triple the force. Throughout the course of the war, she would sink 1 battleship, down 24 planes, and fire on several Japanese-held islands, earning her 15 battle stars. The crew began to call her the Showboat. Aside from the initial blast from the torpedo, the North Carolina was struck by at least one other bomb, but no enemy was ever able to sink her, though they did try. The Japanese even falsely claimed that they sunk the massive battleship at least 6 times throughout the course of the war. The North Carolina was decommissioned in 1947, and she was set to become scrap metal in the 1960s. That's when a group of activists started the Save Our Ship campaign. They were able to raise $330,000, and the next year, the battleship North Carolina was tugged here into Wilmington. Now, the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge was not standing there when they originally brought in the North Carolina. If it was, she would have never been able to dock there, as she is far too tall to make it under the bridge. That bridge was actually built 6 years after the North Carolina was brought in, trapping her and all of her resident spirits here for all eternity. Now, people have been running into the ghosts of the battleship North Carolina for decades. They report seeing shadows walking along the corridors, and uniformed men will appear in random areas of the ship only to vanish seconds later. Phantom noises are also reported. Night watchmen hear sailors rushing down the hallways and up the ladders to their battle stations. And the sound of metal tools will still echo throughout the sickbay. One night, a group of ladies was having a late-night party on board the ship when one of the women had wandered past the executive officer's quarters, where she saw a uniformed man reviewing a logbook. This man looked like he had been plucked right out of the 1940s, but when the lady asked the staff members about him, they laughed, saying that she had just seen a ghost. Another customer complained that the area outside of the sick bay smelled strongly of alcohol and burnt clothing. During the ship's years of service, a burn victim from the Ticonderoga was rushed on board the ship to be treated in the sick bay. He would tragically die later on that evening, but the smell still lingers there from time to time. These are all rare occurrences, and many paranormal investigators believe that what people are actually experiencing on the battleship North Carolina are what is known as residual hauntings. Now, we did talk a little bit about residual hauntings back in the Mansions episode when we were talking about the Bergwin Wright house. That one, it was more likely caused by the intense emotions, but here it is more likely the more common cause of this, because these men would actually live on the ship for years at a time, and they would do the same jobs over and over again, which would imprint the activity on the ship to now be played back in a loop like a broken record. This is why people will see shadows walking through the corridors and hear sailors rushing to their battle stations. The ship is just replaying old activities in that sense. But not all these spirits are residual. However, there are reports of a blonde sailor who has been seen frequently in the area of the torpedo strike. He has also been spotted looking out portholes on the ship. Well, that concludes this week's video and the month of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Wilmington. I hope you enjoyed hearing some of the darkest stories the beautiful city on the beach has to offer over the last month. From the mysterious Highlander along the deadly river to the road where slaves were marched in chains. From the alleyway where a man was killed due to mistaken identity to the cemetery where a man was buried alive. From the cemetery that looks more like a state park to the cemetery where the people who time forgot reside. And finally, to the ship with sailors still managing their battle stations. The Cape Fear River, Mount Misery Road, St. Thomas Preservation Hall Alleyway, St. James Graveyard, Oakdale Cemetery, Bellevue Cemetery, and the Battleship North Carolina. Don't forget to check out some of my other playlists while you are here on Stormi Teaches Music. I release a cover video on Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern and a video of me teaching the song covered on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. You can catch the live stream of the lesson on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on my Patreon. On the Stormi Does Art playlist, I have some partial videos of the live stream you can get on my Patreon for the gold tier or higher. Those streams are done daily at 11 a.m. Eastern. There is a link to my Patreon in the description box and comments below. Time for the poll for the city we will be visiting in December of 2025. I already have a city planned for November, and you will find out that on next Tuesday. This will be another international city that we'll be visiting in December. In the comments below, choose between A, Dublin, Ireland, B, St. Petersburg, Russia, C, Madrid, Spain, or D, Rome, Italy. Also, I do have a one-time donation option on my Patreon that goes towards building a new form of public school system. This will be a non-profit organization that will teach our children how to think, not what to think. I believe that the recent events, it has proven that the current public school system is toxic, and it has been indoctrinating the most innocent and those who should be most protected. Everything donated to that option on my Patreon goes 100% into this fund. I am also willing to open up to teaming up with PragerU, TPUSA, and any other independent, moderate, or conservative, even liberals who want nothing to do with the radical socialism that we have been seeing rising over the last 15 years. Any of those kind of content creators who would like to help with this idea, I'm willing to team up with. Finally, check out my Stormi Talks True Crime for some of the most heinous crimes in history. New videos are posted on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. For anyone who wants to make a one-time donation to this channel to help keep it running while I'm building my audience, there is a QR code to my Venmo and CashApp on the screen. There is also a link to both in the description box and comments below. These donations will help make sure that I am able to get these videos up on time. I would have more time for the recording, filming, and editing that I do all on my own. So any help is appreciated. If you are ever in Wilmington, North Carolina area, sign up for the Wilmington Ghosts Walking Tour or the Wilmington Spirits and Spirits Pub Crawl with U.S. Ghost Adventures. You can have me or one of our other talented guides show you around the historic downtown and hear some of the darkest stories the beautiful city on the beach has to offer. While you are visiting, if you decide you want to stay or buy a vacation home, check out my Moving to Coastal Carolina channel and contact me, as I am a licensed realtor in the southeastern North Carolina area. Now tune in next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern for our new city that we will be visiting here on my Stormi Tells Ghost Stories channel, on my Girls Rock Productions channel. Until then, have a great week, a happy Halloween, and be safe.